with reality.
So, servus Leute, willkommen zu einer weiteren Folge von KF. Heute mal etwas Besonderes oder etwas Ungewöhnliches. Ich möchte nämlich heute quasi die Frage beantworten und zumindest klar begründen, warum zumindest ich davon ausgehe, dass wir den nächsten großen Konflikt verlieren werden, vorausgesetzt es ändern sich gewisse Dinge nicht. Das möchte ich tun, indem ich 3 große Themengebiete anschneide. Zuerst einmal in klassischer KF-Manier, ja, eine Rückkehr zu den Wurzeln. Wirtschaftsgagger, wunderschöne Zahlen, Daten, Graphen, Fakten. Danach, wer sich da durchgebissen hat oder das Video einfach vorspult, der darf sich dann mit den coolen Themen beschäftigen, nämlich unseren klassischen Geopolitik-Geschwurbel. Aber diesmal weniger von uns, sondern lasse ich mal wirklich teilweise Experten reden, ja, Vorträge von der Theresianischen Militärakademie sind hier drin und so weiter. Also alles kurze Ausschnitte, die aber zusammengebracht einen Sinn ergeben. Und den Sinn werdet ihr am Ende dann auch verstehen. Denn der dritte Teil ist dann etwas, philosophischer, esoterischer, ja, damit auch diese Leute auf ihre Kosten kommen. Aber ich finde, alle 3 Dinge zusammen sind extrem wichtig. Und erst wenn alle 3 Dinge zusammen angepackt werden, kann man die Situation, in der wir uns heute befinden, überhaupt erst lösen. Weil wenn man nur eins von den 3 löst, keine Ahnung, die finanzielle Sache, dann hat man immer noch das Problem, dass immer noch extrem wenig Leute für dieses Land kämpfen möchten. Ja, und das hat einen speziellen Grund. Und das ist nicht einfach nur mal so geregelt mit einer neuen PR-Kampagne. Das hat einen tiefgehenden Grund. Was wahrscheinlich passieren wird und was wieder das Ganze, also was so eine klassische Demokratielösung ist, man wird die Probleme nicht lösen, sondern man wird sie einfach auf der Zeitachse verschieben und vielleicht jetzt mit Gelddruck anfangen oder irgendeine andere Finanzkasperei. Aber die Probleme bleiben ja immer noch da. Und das ist eben genau das, woran wir wahrscheinlich jetzt scheitern werden und was halt wirklich sehr, sehr, sehr schwerwiegende Konsequenzen für uns alle haben wird, ist, dass zwar die Probleme verwaltet werden, aber nie gelöst werden. Und das funktioniert, solange man keine echten Feinde hat. Ja? Aber sobald sich die Lage ändert und man wieder echte Konflikte kämpfen muss, dann reicht das nicht. Ich möchte nicht zu viel vorwegnehmen. Es wird trocken teilweise. Es wird euch wahrscheinlich auch sehr, 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 sehr aufregen, was manche Sachen hier gesagt werden. Und es wird wahrscheinlich auch gegen Sachen gehen, die man sonst irgendwo hört. Aber lasst es auf euch wirken und am Ende geht wirklich daran und sagt, wo kann ich, also ihr habt alle verschiedene Startpunkte, ihr habt alle verschiedene Fähigkeiten, was von den genannten Sachen könnt ihr beitragen, dass es besser wird? Oder wenn das eben nicht der Fall ist, wo könnt ihr schauen, dass ihr für euer Umfeld, für eure Familie, für eure Freunde sinnvolle Entscheidungen trefft? Die ersten 14 Minuten ungefähr wird es um den Petrodollar gehen und wie genau, also es ist unfassbar wichtig, das Gesamtsystem zu verstehen und es geht mir dann nicht darum zu sagen, so, oh, wie böse das ist und oh, das ist mir scheißegal. Es ist halt einfach so. Ich möchte hier mit diesem Video einfach nur betrachten, was ist. Von verschiedensten Blickwinkeln, von verschiedensten Leuten, die auch nichts miteinander zu tun haben, erzählen sehr ähnliche Sachen von verschiedensten Blickwinkeln, von verschiedenen Grundpositionen aus. Und das ist eine sehr wichtige Sache. Weil wenn das passiert, dann ist das meistens ein Indikator dafür, dass es, doch etwas an dieser Sache dran ist. Und dass das nicht von irgendwo herkommt. Es wird viel, viel, viel Probleme geben, aber gleichzeitig in großen Krisen sind auch große Chancen. Und das dürfen wir nie vergessen. Also, viel Spaß.
For those that are not familiar with the petrodollar system, very, very simply, the arrangement was the large Middle East oil producers would price their oil in dollars. What that means functionally is they're going to make a lot of dollar revenue each and every day. Well, the arrangement was you take those dollars and you go buy US treasuries, you go buy government debt, you recycle those dollar revenues back into US Treasury debt. So here we're going to go through the math. You have to look at who is an importer of energy, who is an exporter of energy, who is a buyer of Western sovereign debt, and who is not. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to show the cracks in the petrodollar system. But if you're not familiar, it's really, really critical. We outline a couple key concepts very, very quickly. So here we're looking at the balance of trade for the US, or the difference between US imports and US exports. Now, in the US, we run a very, very large trade deficit. Per quarter, it works out to about $218 billion per quarter. The current account, as you can see, is basically the trade balance. Now, this is true not just for the US, but other countries like the UK. What this means is that current account, that $1 trillion per year, over the past 4 quarters here in the US, that has to get financed somehow. And here, looking at France, we can see another very, very strong inverse correlation between the price of oil and the current account. And this is due to the fact that France and UK are both huge net importers of energy. Now, it should be noted for the UK, their current account mainly tracks their crude oil production. And their crude oil production has been in decline for quite some time now. If they had not done this, their current account deficit would probably not be nearly as wide. But what is the effect from oil going higher? Well, if you're UK, if you're France, and you rely on imports for all of your energy needs, what is going to happen with a higher oil price is you are going to be pressured. There's going to be an immediate deterioration of your current account, of your trade deficit, which is going to, of course, affect your current account by $3.3 billion per day. Now, that is every net importer in aggregate. But the other side of that coin, of course, is that exporters are going to see an improvement of the same amount, $3.3 billion per day. So here we go through the example with the UK. Anyone who is a net importer of energy, like the UK, like France, they have to, by definition, because their current account is starting to blow out into a deficit, by definition, they have to attract that foreign capital, that foreign financing, in order to finance the current account deficit. The current account deficit, trade deficits don't just get financed magically, right? They have to be financed somehow. Well, how they're financed is by inflow of capital from the rest of the world. What this means is that now they have to compete with the rest of the world, with other sovereign debt markets, and offer higher interest rates. Well, what do higher interest rates cause? That causes a tightening of financial conditions and dampens growth in that country. Not only that, but due to their importer status and due to the fact that oil is starting to push them into a terms of trade shock, higher oil also means higher inflation, and a weakening currency only exacerbates this. And again, here we can look at the pound and see that generally, going back to the GFC, the pound has been weakening. And that is due to the fact that Great Britain or France or whoever it may be that is a net importer, they don't have control over the dollar. And remember, oil is priced in dollars. So with a higher dollar price and a worsening of your trade deficit, of your current account, your terms of trade, that is going to pressure your currency and only make the situation even worse. Both of those two forces in tandem pressure interest rates higher. They have to compete with the rest of the world for foreign capital, meaning higher interest rates. And they're also going to have higher inflation due to the fact that, of course, oil is moving much higher. Here we can see the global creditor and global debtor positions. And obviously, the US is a huge overconsumer. We are about 80 to 85% of the net debt. And generally, our current account is financed by, if we look, the surplus countries, the creditor nations like Europe, like advanced Asia, and like oil. What that means, by the way, is GCC and the oil producers. This is going to be really, really critical. So it's important for people to understand. Advanced Europe and advanced Asia, they cannot provide credit anymore because they are being pushed into a current account deficit due to the fact that oil is absolutely soaring. So they are no longer able to be a creditor. The GCC, they used to be kind of a counter-cyclical, this is that petrodollar system, they used to be a kind of counter-cyclical ballast where, yeah, Europe and Asia might be subject to the whims of kind of global economic cycle, but the GCC, people always needed oil. They always needed natural gas. They always needed energy. So they were always running pretty large surpluses. They could always recycle those revenues back into, in this case, US Treasury debt. But wait, if the importer current account worsens by $3.3 billion per day, that means that the exporters of oil, their current account is improving by the same amount. So it's a wash. No, it depends on who is an importer and who is an exporter. The GCC, if they were a huge beneficiary and the Strait of Hormuz was not closed, therefore they got to capitalize on the higher oil price, therefore make more dollar revenue, therefore recycle more dollars into US treasuries, that would actually increase petrodollar liquidity. As we know, they are a strong buyer of US treasuries. But what if the beneficiary was a country like Russia or Brazil, a BRICS member who, by the way, are all de-dollarizing? Well, that story is much, much different. So again, it's not just the kind of aggregate in some nominal amount of dollars, petrodollars, before and after the war, before and after the price spike. You have to look at who is an importer and who is an exporter. And is that importer or that exporter generally a large buyer of US treasuries or other Western sovereign debt? Post-war, we can see that the story is very, very different. So Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, part of the petrodollar system, largely they would recycle a lot of their dollar revenues. Their oil exports are down by more than 50%. Iraq, UAE, their oil exports are down almost, just to an astounding degree. Iraq down 80%, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia down 55%. I believe the UAE is down by 75 or 80%. So those petrodollars, the amount of dollar revenue that those countries that normally are a huge buyer of US treasuries, they are all hurt by the war. Who is benefiting? Countries like Brazil, who you don't see in the pre-war slide there. You don't see Brazil there. They have moved up into 5th place, surpassing UAE and Iraq. Well, they're part of BRICS. They are de-dollarizing. They are much more diversified with how they invest their surplus. But if you look at who is benefiting, Russia, they're sanctioned. We defaulted on our debt obligations to them. We quote unquote seized their FX reserves. So they are certainly not at all 0% into the petrodollar. And of course, Brazil as well. They're part of BRICS. The Middle East oil producers, they are all down huge. So Russia and Brazil are definitely not recycling into our debt, into Western sovereign debt. And Canada and the US, again, the kind of more developed markets, generally don't recycle very much. So you can already see where there might be a bit of a squeeze going on. So what ends up happening? The dollar supply feels tighter. Importers need more dollars. If you're in, for example, France or the UK, you need more dollars to pay your oil and energy bill. But the new exporters are not flooding the market with fresh bond buying capital. They are not in the developed sovereign debt markets like the Middle East and the GCC and those normal, usual petrodollar participants. So what happens? The DXY strengthens. That's the dollar index. And this is kind of the classic oil spike pattern. But it's amplified because the recycling of petrodollars is less efficient. Less dollars are making it back into US sovereign debt. So the usual buyers being, countries like Japan and Europe, they're being pushed from a current account surplus into a current account deficit. Well, by definition, that means that they are no longer providing credit to the rest of the world. So at the exact same time, by the way, this shows the exact math that ends up working out to about $500 million per day in that kind of high quality capital that used to go into developed market sovereign debt. that is no longer doing so. Because at the very same moment that these net importers, who are usually large buyers of US Treasuries, at the very same moment their current account deficits are widening, meaning they are turning from a creditor to a debtor and having to compete and get folks to buy the same global capital pool to buy their debt. At the very moment that their current account deficit is widening and worsening by $3.3 billion per day, therefore, put another way, the inverse of that is true, which is that they are requiring more foreign financing, more foreign credit. At the very same moment, the bond-friendly capital from the traditional petrodollar recyclers is actually shrinking.
You can't ignore the reality. Start with the reality. But the reality doesn't lead you to discriminate. The reality just allows you to deal with the reality.
And that reality is the victims and perpetrators of knife and violent crime are predominantly young black men.
Yeah, and if that's the case, you're not going to deal with it better by pretending it's something other than it is.
Darüber hinaus aber noch natürlich mittelfristig Aufrüstung. Konventionelles Gleichgewicht kriegt man dadurch wieder her, dass man halt in die Quantität und Qualität geht. An sich ja fast valide. Wir freuen uns auch alle Soldaten drüber. Sie freuen sich, glaube ich, genauso wie wir, dass es jetzt wieder ein bisschen Haushaltsmittel gab. Bei uns ist die Tendenz schon, na gut, lassen wir das. Aber das Problem der Synchronisation. Während Russland bereits jetzt seine Rüstungsindustrie so weit hat und seine Rekrutierungsmechanismen, dass sie nicht nur die Verluste kompensieren, sondern aufwachsen, also jeden Tag größer und stärker werden, sind wir noch dabei, unsere Rüstungsindustrie wieder anzuwerfen und Wehrpflicht zu diskutieren. Also zum Beispiel in Deutschland jetzt bei Ihnen nicht, dankenswerterweise, aber in vielen anderen Ländern schon. Das heißt, die Synchronisation ist das Problem. Das heißt, wenn wir uns jetzt alle wie ein Mann entscheiden würden in NATO-Ländern, okay, wir machen das Richtige, wir rüsten auf und wollen wieder dahin kommen, wo wir waren. Was war Ihr Ziel? 2032, glaube ich. Ja, also bei uns gibt es auch ein 35er-Ziel und wenn man daran glaubt, ist schön, ist egal, wo es liegt. Auf jeden Fall gibt es zwischen jetzt und diesem Zeitpunkt ein Zeitfenster, wo es eine konventionelle Überlegenheit gibt von Russland gegenüber uns. Und weil das ein Zeitfenster ist, das sich irgendwann schließt, leben wir jetzt in der sicherheitspolitisch gefährlichsten Situation, die wir alle, außer die schon bei der Kuba-Krise gelebt haben, die wir alle erlebt haben. Weil eine Gelegenheit kann ich nur nutzen, solange sie besteht. Und wenn wir darauf hinarbeiten, diese Gelegenheit zu beenden durch Aufrüstung, ist die Gelegenheit bis dahin bestehend. Das Paradox ist also, dass die Aufrüstung, die wir jetzt betreiben, die Kriegsgefahr mittelfristig erhöht. Kriegsgefahr, wie kann das ungefähr ausschauen? Ich möchte jetzt nicht alle Szenarien runterbeten, die man sich so vorstellen kann, aber nehmen wir mal an, der Ukraine-Krieg ist irgendwann aus. Russland ist in seine Friedensstandorte zurückgekehrt und hat rekonstituiert sich, ja, ergänzt, bildet neu aus. Und dann macht man irgendeine Aktion, eine Spezialoperation oder irgendwas Limitiertes. Ich meine, das Musterbeispiel ist die Isolierung von Kaliningrad, einfach einmal mit 2 Brigaden durchzufahren. Ja, das Risiko für Russland ist, man muss sich unter Protest wieder zurückziehen, wenn die NATO den NATO-Alarm ausruft und sagt, wir sind im Krieg. Aber der mögliche Gewinn ist, vor allem dann, wenn die konventionellen Kräfte nicht ausreichen, um diese Antwort zu ergreifen oder gar nicht das geübt haben. Bis jetzt ist der mögliche Gewinn ist, dass die Länder anfangen, und ich glaube, mein Land wird da ganz vorne dabei sein, eine politische Diskussion losgehen zu lassen und sagen, naja, Moment, also ja, das ist nicht schön, aber ehrlich gesagt, das können wir, also jetzt dafür in den Krieg für Baltikum, wenn wir das verkaufen können, und abgesehen davon, wer soll es denn machen? Das heißt, aus russischer Sicht, ich würde es versuchen, wenn die Gelegenheit da ist. Egal was, wenn ein Verteidigungsbündnis nicht sofort auf eine auch limitierte Inklusion reagiert, ist es politisch am Ende. Was ist das Ziel Russlands? Genau das. Der billigste Weg, das zu verfolgen. Szenario. Wir sind keine Prophetensoldaten, wir denken in Szenarien. An denen richten wir uns aus. Datum kann ich Ihnen also deswegen leider keins geben, wann das soweit sein wird. Hoffentlich nie.
Allied armies simply don't have insufficient quantity at sufficient readiness, particularly armored brigades and combat aviation formations. Hopefully, this is being worked on. But next, let's take a look at Tier 3, NATO's surge element. Consisting of some 500,000 troops, this grouping has forces ready to fight within 30 to 180 days. This tier is all about mass mobilization, lower readiness brigades, divisions and corps, reservist-heavy national contingents. There would also be US-based reinforcement formations requiring transatlantic movement. This is where total national defense and wartime industrial production become relevant. Think US corps deploying from the continental United States, German and French reserve divisions activated, and Nordic and Baltic nations expanding their conscript-based forces. And yes, we recognize that 30 to 180 days is a long time, particularly if Tier 1 and Tier 2 haven't held the line. This is exactly why the first two tiers, and the race to deploy them, matters so much. Tier 3 generates the warfighting depth for a protracted conflict. And so this might be what a realistic escalation ladder looks like. In weeks 1 and 2, a Russian/Belarusian exercise is announced near the Lithuanian border, with no declared end date. You'll see GPS spoofing in the Baltics and cyber attacks on Baltic government infrastructure. It's nothing that definitively crosses a legal threshold for military response, especially since these activities have happened from time to time. But then, in week 3, we'd perhaps see a NATO intelligence assessment that Russian forces could reach operational readiness for an offensive within 10 to 14 days. At this point, Article 4 consultations begin in Brussels and a heated debate in Allied capitals ensues. Is this coercion and harassment, probing, or is this the real thing? Therein lies the decision problem. Activating Tier 1 prematurely is expensive, it's politically risky, and, well, potentially escalatory. However, waiting too long means those 10 days on paper become 3 days in practice, after NATO has spent a week arguing about intent. The German operational planning community has a phrase which we'll try to say in the native language as best we can. Wir gehen, wenn wir müssen, und zwar so, wie wir sind. The first problem is a movement problem. How do you physically move, for example, a German brigade to the NATO eastern flank in Lithuania? Next is staying supplied. Once that brigade arrives, how do you keep it in the fight? And third is surviving the journey. You see, there's a threat problem. In a contested environment, logistics formations are targets. So now we go into further detail on these three problems. Starting with the movement problem, Germany is Europe's logistics crossroads, but it also risks being Europe's bottleneck. Did you know that there's actually a dedicated Bundeswehr unit for the movement of Allied forces through German territory? It goes by the name Logistics Battalion 163, Delmenhorst, and it's specifically responsible for reception, staging and onward movement, or RSOM. The unit receives Allied forces at ports and railheads and feeds them into the Eastern Pipeline. With this in mind, there are three main west-to-east corridors, all heading to and then through Frankfurt-Oder before heading through Poland. First, Benelux, Rotterdam or Antwerp, to Ruhr, to Hanover, to Magdeburg, to Frankfurt-Oder. Second, Bremerhaven, to Hanover, to Magdeburg, to Frankfurt-Oder. And 3 is Hamburg to Berlin to Frankfurt-Oder. Now, a full brigade road march generates hundreds of vehicles. This includes combat vehicles, fuel tankers, supply trucks, field ambulances, engineering vehicles, and command vehicles. And at proper march spacing, a brigade column can stretch 50 to 80 kilometers on the road. The bottleneck and movement problem comes into play as the average speed of military vehicles is significantly slower than civilian traffic, and their movement requires road closures, bridge weight restrictions, and police escorts. Furthermore, Germany's Autobahn bridge network sees many structures having axle load and total weight restrictions that require route surveys and sometimes reinforcement before military convoys can pass. And so, if Germany's medium force brigade, Panzer Brigade 21, were to head to Kaunas, Lithuania, that's approximately 1,200 kilometers by road. Even with wheeled vehicles, which this brigade has, it's still a multi-day road march with enormous fuel, maintenance and coordination requirements. Indeed, fuel is itself a major consideration and potential problem. Contracts with Tank und Rast, Germany's motorway service operator for military convoy refueling, must be pre-arranged, and this is actually how the Bundeswehr plans to fuel a brigade-scale move through Germany. There's also transport by rail, although it has its limits. Rail is faster for bulk equipment and reduces road wear, and Germany has a capable military rail infrastructure, but there's a gauge problem for the time being. This exists at the Polish-Lithuanian border, where rail gauge changes from European standard to the Soviet-era wider gauge. As a result, equipment must be offloaded, transferred, and reloaded, presenting a major bottleneck. Sure, Rail Baltica, the new European gauge rail from Warsaw to Tallinn, is under construction, but it's not yet complete as a fully operational military route and has been subject to delays and funding shortages. Making things more precarious is that there's only one single existing railway that goes through the Suwałki Gap, a notable choke point most likely to be interdicted in a conflict, as Russian and Belarusian forces could sever this line in a matter of hours. The practical conclusion is that rail gets you to eastern Poland, road gets you through the Suwałki Gap. NATO's own assessment is that the political and bureaucratic friction in the movement pipeline remains one of the hardest problems to solve, because it requires political decisions, not just military ones. But now it's time to more closely examine the vulnerability that is the Suwałki Corridor, also known as the Suwałki Gap. Whatever route is chosen, troops reinforcing Lithuania must pass through or around this corridor, a roughly 65-kilometer strip of land between the heavily militarized Russian exclave of Kaliningrad and Belarus. It is the only land connection between Lithuania and the rest of NATO. Passing through this gap is dangerous, as Russians from Kaliningrad have permanent line of sight over everything moving through this corridor. On top of this, Russia's Iskander-M ballistic missiles based in Kaliningrad have a range that covers the entire Baltic theatre. Every road, rail line, port and airfield from Warsaw to Tallinn is within reach. Belarusian and Russian forces positioned on either side could physically close the corridor in hours, and even if they don't close it militarily, the threat alone shapes every movement decision: convoy timing, spacing, air defense coverage requirements. And so the Suwałki Gap is not just a geographic feature, it is a strategic timer. Once it closes or credibly threatens to close, the reinforcement window snaps shut.
Not just the war in Iran, but also the war in Ukraine, which is threatening other shipping areas too. As boring as it is, wars fought over trade routes tend to be global in nature, and this is already spinning out of control to the point that I don't think we can avoid this becoming rather serious. As of right now, 4 of the world's most important maritime choke points are directly threatened with combat action. Hormuz, the Bab, Suez, and the ever-forgotten Turkish Straits linking the Black Sea with the Med. Remember, Ukraine and Russia have been targeting each other continually on the high seas, so that's another choke point threatened by war. Granted, Turkey, despite their issues, is a little bit more stable and has so far been able to guarantee safety through the Turkish Straits for the ships that choose to go through there, but still, it's a rather important waterway that historically is quite relevant. A lot of wars have been fought over the Turkish Straits, and that's something that we should probably keep an eye on. More indirectly this week, the Strait of Gibraltar is threatened by instability and mass migration to the point that it's affecting the strategic balance of the region. It's harder, and it's debatable, you can disagree, but it's harder to say, well, the Strait of Gibraltar is now going to be part of the Iran war. I wouldn't go that far, but what is undeniable is that it's threatening stability, and anytime stability is threatened with a global maritime choke point kind of in the general vicinity, things get kind of dicey. To be honest, at this point, all we need is some kind of crisis in Panama or some kind of kerfuffle in the Strait of Malacca, and we could be in a bit of a pickle here. The Strait of Malacca has been coming up a lot in a PACOM context with, Chinese expansion and the maritime trade moving through that region. I wouldn't call it threatened. I think the Strait of Malacca is fine at the moment. Same thing with Panama. There's really no concern down there now. But the fact that we're having to think about this in the first place, just think of how shocking that is. Just think of how absurd that is. This little minor desert war in the Middle East has now transcended to include most of the planet. Thankfully, most of the global impacts are not missiles and bombs. They're just economic and energy related, but still, this is the stepping stones are in place already for this to escalate much further. I don't know if it will get any worse or how this is going to expand, but what's very clear is that this war is no longer localized to Iran. Since the rhetoric and strategic moves this week have continued to indicate that the war is going to continue on for some time and will probably return to more full-scale bombing, the situation is not looking super great. Peace is completely off the table for the time being, and if we are trying to guess when when this war might end, I'm not seeing any indications that this conflict is going to be over anytime soon. I've seen many others in the industry speculate that this war might last until the end of the year, and I think that's not an unreasonable assessment, unfortunately. As it stands right now, the walk-away theory is also looking less likely because the sunk cost fallacy is driving much of the decision-making regarding the war, so we've got that to contend with. And just to be brutally honest for a minute, the Iranians have really been putting up a fight. We don't have to like it, but the Iranians have not just been able to survive the American bombing, but they have actually been able to maintain a lot of over-the-horizon targeting capability, either via the use of proxy groups, such as the attack on Egypt, or in the cyber realm, like their alleged involvement in the Minnesota cyber attacks. Classic warfare history, right? The defender has the advantage. And in this case, I really do not know what the grand strategy is here at the Pentagon regarding how this war is planned to be fought. Obviously, the availability of munitions is probably playing more of a role in this than we might think. The reason we're not hitting them as hard as we thought we would is maybe we don't have the bombs to do it. I don't know. But the uncertainty and the lack of a clear military objective regarding the war is going to complicate things for a while, and we're just going to have to wait and see. I know that's classic at this point, right? We're just going to have to wait and see. But there has not been any major American targeting in Iran for several days now, and we're really due for another round of strikes after last weekend's sorties were called off. So I guess we're still kind of trapped on this roller coaster ride, and we're just going to have to see what our politicians decide to do with it, and hope that the homeland isn't affected too.
Inside. Any ships passing through them are exposed at multiple angles. There's very little navies can do to protect them. This is crucial. Navies, like the American Navy, benefit from space and the ability to maneuver. On the open ocean, the United States Navy has no peer, but none of that matters. It's irrelevant in the Strait of Hormuz. None of that matters in the Strait of Hormuz. What Kasich had in mind is a sort of straw man in the form of, let's call it like a caricature of Alfred Thayer Mann. Mann was all about the organized force, or the fleet, which was the center of all of his thinking. Naval strategy, according to him, was all about having the predominant force, a dominant blue water force that was necessary and sufficient for controlling the sea. So that's Mann and his followers were really loath to admit that sometimes geography was more important. So according to Castex, the basic argument of the Maonians is that if my fleet is superior to yours and I enter a given zone, then you have no choice but to return to port and stay there. Castex says that, okay, sometimes this is true. But even then, sea control is temporary because you're predominant only when you're present, but eventually your ships go back home, they return to base, so they go back home or something, and the moment one turns one's back, an enterprising adversary will be able to do all sorts of things, thanks in part to the complicity of the land, and that's a word that he used. The smaller the body of water, the more relevant the land becomes, and the more technology extends the land's reach. Thus, in small bodies of water, particularly in very narrow places like the Strait of Hormuz, the only way to control the sea is by controlling the land. So, one way we might have been able to stop them if we don't control the strait, we can at least deter them, right? Make it so scary. If you close it, you're going to hurt. But we didn't deter them. And guess what? Whatever deterrence value might have had is gone because we hit them with our best shot. To paraphrase Pat Benatar, right? We hit them with our best shot. At least we could do more to hurt Iran, but the reality is that Trump recognized that the U.S. government is not prepared to do more. We don't have an appetite for hurting Iran more than we already have. Thus, that's our best shot. And guess what? Iran's still standing. So now whatever deterrence value there might have been is completely gone. Kasich describes the servitudes as all the things that impinge upon pure military logic, things that argue against doing the most expeditious military thing to do. Because guess what? Other priorities are more important. There are other things that are more important. They can be political servitudes, economic servitudes, moral servitudes, and yes, geographic servitudes. Sometimes you can't do this thing because it's going to ruin your economy. Or you can't do this thing because it's going to completely delegitimate the conflict in the eyes of everybody. We could just nuke all of Iran and kill all Iranians, but that becomes really problematic for all sorts of reasons. There are a zillion very good reasons not to nuke Iran. And as a result, even though that would be the most expeditious way of winning this war, we're not going to do that. The global economy is on the line, the American economy is on the line, our moral legitimacy, domestic legitimacy, international legitimacy, fertilizer matters, everything matters. So you could seal off Iran's coast with a naval blockade completely and for the duration, but not without profound economic costs to everyone. Is it worth it? That would be like a contest in which us and Iran would be holding our hands over a candle to see who could do it longer. I don't think there's a way to win this, and I guarantee you the Iranians can hold their hands over a candle much longer than we can. Relatedly, we have to manage our relations with other players, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, the Emiratis, the Israelis, etc. Some policies suit some of them more than others. We can't please everybody. Maybe we can only please one. Either way, it all needs to be thought through. You have to prioritize. You have to make tough choices. Whose opinion matters most to us? Whom should we try to please? Whom should we displease? Whom should we help? Whom should we screw over? This is all normal. This is all normal. This is what happens. But you have to be able to think it through, and you have to be able to think it through consciously, deliberately. things that I don't think our government is really capable of doing. Militaries, modern British, French, German, etc., where they have lots of capabilities, but I believe in all of them, the percentage of those, the proportion of those forces that we could describe in terms of kind of at-risk maneuver, the grunts who are actually shooting and getting shot at is really pretty small. So I'm trying to I just want to think through what are the implications for them. Does this make them more or less vulnerable in modern warfare, or more or less capable of absorbing attrition than they might have been in the past, or certainly than they should be? Is there a warning that Western military should be taking heeding?
Very much so. It means that those units are very fragile. Now, the killed in action rate at the start of a conflict is going to be lower for them. Vehicles, you can either shoot at metal or you can shoot at men. As long as you have metal, you're going to be incurring lower losses among your men. And that's a very noticeable trend. To go back to the Russian Second Combined Arms Army, Second Combined Arms Army starts the big Avdiivka-Pokrovsk offensive, having been pulled off the line, completely refreshed its vehicle park. Everyone has all the tanks they're supposed to. Everyone has all the IFVs they're supposed to. They're fully kitted out with metal. At the start of the offensive, they're heavily engaged. They're taking heavy losses, but they're more balanced and they're lower. You can see it over time as they burn through their vehicle parks, casualty rates start skyrocketing. The lesson for the European militaries is that, yes, in the opening weeks of a conflict, they're going to be taking significant losses, but at least it'll be somewhat more controlled. As they lose their vehicle parks, they're going to become extremely fragile. And there's not a lot you can do about that except for having a lot of spare infantry. Right now, every Russian brigade, every Russian regiment, and additionally at the divisional level, every Russian division has what's called a reserve rifle battalion, which is a force of it's a battalion that it counts about 550 men, of which 450 of those are trigger pullers. It is a completely non-viable unit in every other sense of the word. It can feed itself and it can maybe transport itself. That's it. What it does, it solely exists to be a container for extra infantrymen that you can pull out and refill your battalions with as you go. And when you're looking at European force structure, that's basically what you need, because because those infantry dismounts are going to drain fast, and you're going to lose your combat power as they get drained.
That's interesting. Okay, so one lesson is, hey, European militaries, you need more infantry units so that you've got more of a reserve, even if your force structure doesn't necessarily call for it, but attrition is going to make this a necessity. What about also this issue where, like with all the European militaries, they might have really awesome kit, they're going to roll into battle with their fancy CV-90s and their Leopards and whatnot, but they don't have many of them. And it's not like World War II where you can just crank them out by the thousands. Does that change? Are they? One thought is that very quickly they will end up not having their CV-90s and the Leopard 2s, meaning now they're on foot, or now they're sort of digging out of their mothballs their patents that are somewhere in some storage locker somewhere. What happens in the second week of the war when there's small numbers of CV-90s and Leopard 2s are gone?
It becomes a choice. Because as I've said, once you lose those vehicles, once your force is mostly dismounted, your casualty rates are going to skyrocket.
Okay.
And it becomes very much a political choice because, as I said before, if you don't have those infantry reserves, you're also going to burn through your infantry very quickly. So it's not just a matter of digging the Pattons or the M113s, though I would note that the M113s have proven to be perfectly useful in Ukraine. It's a good vehicle. And even the Pattons, one of the reasons why T-62 has been taken out swords by the Russians is that having a tank is better than not having a tank.
Yeah.
A Patton.
Better a Patton than no Patton.
Exactly. So that in and of itself is not going to be a crisis level. What's going to be the real political crisis is that since you don't have the manpower reserves, you're going to have to be calling up people to chuck them to base. If you want to continue fighting, you're going to be calling up people.
2022, als Russland seinen groß angelegten Angriffskrieg gegen die Ukraine begann. All diese Weckrufe wurden ignoriert. Es wurden keine Vorbereitungen getroffen, die Europäer haben weitergepennt. Um es ganz klar zu sagen, die einzigen, die an dieser Situation Schuld haben, sind wir Europäer. Kein Europäer braucht über die Amerikaner zu schimpfen. Sie haben uns lange genug höflich aufgefordert, mehr zu tun. Es hat alles nichts genützt. Nun macht Trump das, was schon lange im Gespräch war und auf kurz oder lang sowieso passiert wäre. Nur halt früher und auf die harte Tour. Aber wie heißt es so schön, wer nicht hören will, muss fühlen. In meinen Augen muss die Lehre aus den vergangenen Tagen und Wochen sein, dass wir uns niemals wieder militärisch von jemandem abhängig machen dürfen. Die Europäer müssen in der Lage sein, sich selbst zu verteidigen. Deutschland muss in der Lage sein, sich selbst zu verteidigen. Die gute Nachricht ist, wir sind 10-mal reicher als Russland und können die erforderlichen Streitkräfte aufbauen, um uns gegen Russland zu verteidigen. Nur wir müssen damit jetzt endlich anfangen. Und es wird nicht von heute auf morgen gehen, womit wir zur schlechten Nachricht kommen.
I think it's important that you be willing to walk in another man's shoes and listen to them and understand they may have legitimate reasons to be disappointed with us. Even Winston Churchill, who had a bit of love for Americans, said you can trust the Americans after they've exhausted all possible alternatives to do the right thing. We frustrate a lot of people in the world, and it's often we're most peevish with our friends. It's like we deal more rationally at times with our enemies and adversaries, and we treat our friends in a very derogatory way and often in a publicly humiliating manner. And I think that is very unproductive, and I never apologize for American foreign policy, but I do try to understand other people's points of view.
In some ways, they're kind of drawing some of the wrong lessons from what makes the Prussian army exceptional. They're copying the outward appearance and not really getting at the heart of what makes the Prussian army exceptional, which is what I try and unpack in the book, kind of this outward look and also the social cohesive bonds and the loyalty to the state in some ways that motivates Prussian soldiers. It makes them maybe pretty hard to defeat on the battlefield. And so the Prussians go on, they win the War of Austrian Succession quite handily. They almost lose the 7 Years' War, but they're saved at the last moment by the death of the Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. And so they kind of go down in history, at least in their own time, as being exceptionally good soldiers.
No, it's a really fascinating argument on a number of levels. And the one I want to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on now is this notion, if you're a non-Prussian officer enjoying or suffering, depending on your point of view, from Prussomania, and again, sort of sticking with the stereotype of 18th century armies, well, here you have this rabble of soldiers from the gutter, as it were, in the 18th century that you, the landed aristocrat officer, have to whip into shape. And you look at the Prussians, and they just seem really good at it. They've whipped these guys into shape through fear and discipline. And man, if only we could have fearful and disciplined soldiers to send into the meat grinder, we do well too on the battlefield. And your point is, there's an ideological element to it for the Prussians that account misses. Tell us about the Prussian soldier. Just say more about that.
Absolutely, yeah. So this idea of the sort of peasant recruit who's beaten into submission by his aristocratic officer, who's probably not a very good professional soldier, is common across all these 18th century armies. And it's something that historians who I look up to, people like Ilya Berkovich and Sasha Mubius, have really tried to unpack and challenge over the last 30 years of sort of scholarly research on this topic. But essentially, I think we do have to wrestle with why the Prussian army was successful. If it's not all the genius of the king, which is kind of the old hero worship, kind of Thomas Carlyle-esque, the great man theory of history, explanation for why the Prussians are so effective, and it's not the fact that they were all essentially robots beaten into shape by discipline who could just march through enemy gunfire, and in the phrase that's often repeated from the 18th century, they're more afraid of their officers than they are the enemy. And there's not a lot of, I think, good evidence for that. And again, Sasha and Ilya have really done a great job of packing that. What is it that makes them so effective? And so the answer that I keep coming back to, I looked at this in my dissertation, I looked at it a little bit in the book as well, is the kind of high level of social cohesion in the Prussian army. If you look at how these men are recruited, many of them are conscripts, almost like the U.S. Army was recruited, say during the Vietnam War and earlier, but they're conscripted in such a way that men from the same locality go into the same unit. And so you have people who know each other and who are, in some cases, related, like uncles and nephews, in the same platoon, in the same company. And so they're hesitant to run away on the battlefield, not necessarily because they're afraid of the officers. I think there probably is some level of fear. You don't want to run away in front of the officers and get in trouble, but also because they don't want to leave their buddies behind, because they don't want to leave the men they know from their village. They don't want to leave, Uncle Johann there on the battlefield by himself. I don't want to run away and leave him. And so this level of social cohesion, in addition to religious ideologies and monarchical ideologies that are really kind of roiling around in the Prussian army at this time, helped turn it into a very highly motivated force, a force that is led a little bit more by a sense of maybe positive inner leadership than just the canes of their officers kind of beating them into combat. And so it's in the 7 Years' War, in the War of Austrian Succession. I disagree with Professor Sable a little bit. I think Fred is probably not up there with Napoleon, but he is a good general in some ways. That probably helps some. But this social cohesion, the high level of training and discipline these men are subjected to, and the leadership of the king, and as Adam Story would say, kind of a laboratory of other very good officers, this is what makes the Prussian army so effective. And it's
wirklich ein Problem, weil wir sind uns ja alle einig, dieses aktuelle Regime kriegt wahrscheinlich die Aufrüstung nicht so zusammen, wie sie sein müsste. Und viele Leute denken sich, okay, wir haben schlechte Politik, was ist die Alternative? Ja, die Alternative ist die Alternative. Also die Organisation, die das Land noch retten könnte, wäre die AfD. Und ich bin ja jemand, der da nicht dran glaubt, weil ich Rechtspopulismus für Blödsinn halte. Und angenommen, die AfD würde jetzt wirklich an die Macht kommen, man muss es so klar sagen, von Russenagenten unterwanderte Partei, die würden ja nicht einmal diese März-Bürokratieaufrüstung machen, sondern die würden dann sagen, ja, Frieden schaffen ohne Waffen, wir machen ein Bündnis mit Russland, wir ergeben uns komplett. Also das sind halt wirklich Wehrkraftzusetzer und das ist auch eine große Gefahr und es ist umso trauriger, weil du eben nicht einmal eine Alternative hast, weil diese Elite, die es bräuchte, um aufzurüsten, die ist nicht zu sehen momentan. Und es gibt momentan keine sichtbare Gegenbewegung.
Start with reality.
The huge qualitative difference between the French and the Prussians. How to replicate that then is to build a national or people's army, and how to do that is to fuse really the state and the military and the citizenry together to think of themselves as one state, with one identity. And enfranchised to a certain extent doesn't mean that these were really proto-liberals or proto-Democrats trying to give everyone the franchise. That wasn't what their goal was. The goal was greater military efficiency. The goal was to give as much of enfranchisement as necessary to the citizenry to make them care about what happened to the state, make them want to fight. And that desire, that passion, that love for the state then would hold them together in battle, keep them from deserting, and those sorts of things. So they attempt to do that. The Prussian king, of course, is not really happy with this measure because he, Austrian monarchy, all of them saw the example of France as not a good thing. Waves of terror, monarchy being guillotined, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, all of them eventually.
einfach festzustellen, das war eine andere deutsche Armee. Aber es wird immer wieder die Politik reingebracht, die Parteienpolitik, die so viel kaputt macht. Und so viel kaputt gemacht hat bei den Jugendlichen, die durchaus bereit wären, wie wir damals auch, sich freiwillig zu melden oder ihren Wehrdienst zu leisten. Die Jugend ist nur anders, nicht besser, nicht schlechter.
Man kämpft für ein Land aus 3 Gründen: Geld, Zwang und Überzeugung. Ich glaube, der Fokus, man sollte wirklich aktiv sich darum bemühen, den 3. Punkt zu verstärken. Ich kann da nicht eine einfache Lösung geben, aber ich halte nach wie vor für die beste Lösung, wenn man die Leute davon überzeugt, dass sie fürs Land kämpfen wollen, dass sie in die Bundeswehr kommen wollen. Und ich glaube nicht, dass, aus meiner Sicht zumindest, ich wollte mich ja mal verpflichten. Ich habe die Tests gemacht im Kreiswehrersatzamt für die Offizierslaufbahn, habe mich dann aber dagegen entschieden. Was hat mich damals bewegt? Das war nicht irgendwie die Erwartung, Kabelfernsehen auf der Stube zu haben, sondern das war der Reiz. Ich wollte mich beweisen. Ich wollte, was weiß ich, Abenteuer. Ich wollte Herausforderung. Wenn ich mir heute eine Bundeswehrwerbung anschaue, sehe ich das nicht in dem Maße, wie ich es mir wünschen würde, muss ich sagen. Dass solche Dinge betont werden. Vielleicht sollte man darauf einen stärkeren Fokus legen. Das heißt, ich würde bei dem Anwerben der Leute, würde ich mehr darauf zielen, dass ich nicht Leute habe, die wegen des Gehaltes kommen. Gehalt ist sicher wichtig, aber ich glaube nicht, dass man die Soldaten primär damit locken sollte durch gute Arbeitsbedingungen. Da bin ich halt, dürfen wir nicht vergessen, ich bin aus dem letzten Jahrtausend. Also ich bin eine andere Generation als das, was heute ist. Ich glaube, einen Soldaten sollte man mit dem Soldatischen locken, nicht mit allem anderen.
A managerial regime is just not appealing. Anything if your government institutions are almost always managerial bureaucracies, and really even Congress to a large extent was just a bunch of people who played a role in the administration of those bureaucracies. I mean, that's not exciting. That just doesn't appeal. That doesn't appeal to men looking to build something or achieve something. You move beyond managerial bureaucracy. You move into a space where politics can be really, there's an art of the possible there. What can we achieve? What are the powers of this? What is this institution positioned to achieve? Let's go do it. That's going to appeal. That's going to appeal to just a different caliber of person, the same sort of person who might go into the private sector, especially might go into a really, really ambitious startup, like one that is focusing on these sort of civilizational questions. And I think that those, certainly you'll see those at the federal level. Really, I think a lot of that at the federal level is still going to have to be primarily cutting, which is exciting, but it's also limiting in what you can do. At the state level, I could see a world where you have people who really spend 30 years at the state level just building political capital, compounding and stewarding it, building really a political machine, which is often a dirty word. And I think that there's ways to, I'm using that in a very broad sense, but they accrue political power, build a network, they remain at that state level, and they use it to just build an entire array of institutions across the state. Think of like Robert Moses as an example of this.
Nowadays, in Ukraine, you can build product 6 to 10 months that it's ready to use in combat. And in Ukraine, you can make a revenue 12 months later, because what is different in Ukraine is that every battalion has a budget to buy. So you literally, instead of having one governmental agency, you have more than 200 procurement people who can buy your thing. And that's fundamental thing which is important for the founders, because you can build and see impact, you can save lives immediately in Ukraine. And if you get that stamp that your product is working in frontline, then in your home market, is it Estonia, Germany, Denmark, name it, you can go to the local military and tell, hey, look, my product is working in Ukraine, what about you? And I see now also change of the governments in Europe to simplify the procurement. It still takes a long time indeed. But the fact is there is huge will to change it. It takes time, but it has never been best time to build defense as is today.
Start with reality.
Series. The Apollo program was a matter of national pride, and people were excited about it, not just as a contest to beat the Russians, but more so because landing on the damn moon was seen as a big deal. People have looked up at it since people existed. It's even an idiom for something unattainable. Might as well wish for the moon, as they'd say. And suddenly people are going there. Americans are going there. That LEM landing stage sitting on the moon is a lasting cultural achievement on par with the pyramids. It's a monument to confidence and ingenuity. A lot of people don't even know that we currently have a manned moon program, Project Artemis. The astronauts are already selected. Launch dates are tentatively planned for a flyby mission slated for 2026. Most people don't know, and half of those that do don't care. SpaceX is optimistically looking at Mars missions this decade. Again, there's widespread whatever about it. There's a deep cultural stagnation that is reflected in Star Trek over the decades. The sense of decline becomes highly apparent in the first 2 seasons of Enterprise in the early aughts, where it's just rehashing old Trek material and just kind of feels tired most of the time.
The parliaments of the West are tired, Anyone who watches them can see that. They're meant to be, or at least they were intended to be, this institution of transparency and honesty, but it's just become a theatre. You've got staged opposition and this kind of fake outrage either side, and these decisions that should be made but are forever put off. The thing is, representatives, as they're called, they don't really represent. They perform representation. And behind that performance is where the real power is, operating through channels that never appear. Whether that's the civil service, as Dominic Cummings and even Liz Truss talks about, whether that's the banks, financial institutions, international bodies and groups like NGOs, or foreign interest groups. This is all the sort of machinery that the liberal institutions refer to as global governance. But it's not really fair, is it? Because it just undermines the people. The problem with liberal democracy, it's not that it fails to deliver some results or a good standard of living. But the problem is that it hides where the power really sits. It's managed decline, as many people say. The real difference is the skin in the game. Who holds risk? And that's really the sharpest difference between the king and the politician. Because the king rode at the front of his army. I mean, it's not a metaphor, they quite literally did. I mean, think about Anglo-Saxon or medieval kings fighting in the front rank. Whether that's King Harold taking an hour at Hastings as he led against the Norman invasion, or King Alfred again, risking his death on the marshes. And the sort of political decision of going to war, the risk was held by the king. If it was a stupid war, then the king would pay for that with his own blood. So his fate was tied to his decisions. I'd think about King Theoden at Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings. His fortress was getting breached and the line was broken, and it was pretty hopeless at that point. But Theoden doesn't hide in the keep. He calls for his horse and he rides out, and he charges into seemingly hopelessness in front of his own men, into what looks like almost certain death. And that image is really strong, even in fiction, because it's actually something real. See, this is honor. It's honor in the old sense, the Germanic sense, the Anglo-Saxon, the Norse sense. There's honor as the willingness to share the fate between you and your people. And the refusal to send other men to die for a cause that you believe in but won't bleed for yourself. Now consider the politician. I mean, think about Tony Blair or George Bush in Iraq. Can you imagine Tony Blair doing this with Iraq? I mean, just picture him at the front of the column, rolling into Basra, rifle in hand, sharing the same fate as the infantry and the other men. Oh, it's just absurd, isn't it? And I think the absurdity is the whole point. I mean, set aside for a moment whether the war was legal or illegal or wise or foolish. Ask a simpler question. Who was it even fought for? The politicians don't hold the risk. They don't ride at the front because there's no honour in the cause. You can't lead the charge for a war you can't justify with your own people. And The absent body of a leader on the battlefield tells you everything about the absent honour behind the decision. And yet, for that war, Britain still gets the blame. You know, we, is what a lot of migrants say, and liberals. We invaded, it's our crimes. And the nation carries the moral weight, while the people who actually made the decisions carry nothing. In fact, they just retire into wealth and comfort. I mean, think about Tony Blair. His son's a billionaire. I'm sure some of those investments for that firm was, you know, from somewhere inconspicuous. Also, he was knighted as well. Tony Blair, that is. He's invited into panels and treated with respect in polite circles, and he faces absolutely no consequences because the system is built to spread and disperse responsibility around until it just disappears. But the king cannot hide behind his people. He stands in front of them, visible, named, and accountable in his own person. See, democracy, for all its talk about accountability, just builds a structure in which nobody's really accountable for anything.
Start.
Seen this used as a master race allegory, don't pollute the blood thing. But this is a story built on mythic ideas, the philosophical over the physical. Looking at this purely in terms of genetics is kind of engaging in the mindset that Tolkien is attacking at multiple levels. It's fixating on the material, on the quantifiable, minds of metal and wheels. One of the central ideas is the replacement of the mythic with the mundane, both in terms of good and evil. The line of long-lived, closer to the gods, superior men replaced with mediocre stewards, regular men with fancy robes, a manager rather than a king. There's no majesty in that, it's just a job. But the scouring of the Shire especially shows us the end of mythic evil too. A magical dark lord in his towering fortress giving way to the petty evil of functionaries, the tyranny of postings, of arbitrary prohibitions and permissions. Sauron is the old evil. The broken Saruman is a new evil, in part because he is petty and has to rely on posted notices and paid thugs to impose his will. And maybe most importantly, because he started out as good, not posing as good or putting up an aspect to deceive, but genuinely well-meaning only to turn profoundly evil after a long period of rationalizations and expedient measures. And that's the evil of our world. Cog-minded lesser men convinced they're the good guys as they slowly destroy what they were once put there to protect. And I think that in the context of the much more widely discussed anti-industrial themes, you know, Saruman cutting down the forest to feed his foundries, the armies of Mordor with mass-produced munitions, great arms and armor contrasted with the elegant craftsmanship of the elves, it's all part of the same thing. I think that's the essence of Tolkien's objection to modernity. It took the beauty, the uniqueness, the epicness out of the world in pursuit of efficiency and orderliness, represented in the physical space by tearing up the countryside to make smoke-belching factories, but also in the mental space, replacing larger-than-life rulers with mundane rules. In that sense, he's not really being contradictory when he mentions leaning both toward anarchy and unconstitutional monarchy. In this mythic ideal sense, a true king doesn't need constitutional constraints because he is a good and moral man who speaks honestly and keeps his word. The people don't need to be coerced into doing the right thing because they're a good and righteous people with their king to guide them by example. It is not meant as a program for a political system. Tolkien isn't suggesting that we scrap all the laws and make the king's rule absolute. Rather, he seems to be suggesting that the ideal, the mythic, is as important as the mundane. The enduring nature of his story seems to support that. And it's kind of a foreign idea for Americans. We expect our presidents to be both good managers and inspiring leaders, but they're often contradictory jobs. Probably why we so often get people that suck at both.
With reality.
Deepest level, and I've been thinking about this for some time. You know, when I was in the Senate, I worked on a report on the surface Navy after the Bonham-Richard burned at Pierside, and there had been the McCain and the Fitzgerald and all these incidents. And I think my deepest fear is that, I think there are a lot of institutions in American society that when you peer under the hood, you realize that there's a kind of soft corruption that's been at work for a long time, and things sort of superficially look good, but actually they don't really function like they're supposed to function. And it's largely because, to your last point, Dimitri, because there's a lot of sort of dishonesty and self-deception most of all. And it would be a national catastrophe and potentially an unrecoverable national catastrophe if that were true of the Navy surface fleet and if we had to learn it on day one of a war. So with that sobering thought, I'll leave the last word to you.
No, that's completely true. And, I think, just to reiterate, what I said earlier, like this is an absolutely catastrophic form of combat, naval combat. This is the kind of combat where you can lose, a dozen warships in the span of a day, right? How long does that take to build that back? It can take years and years and years, right? This means you have to get a lot right in peacetime. And so, when we encounter misplaced priorities or excuses, saying, oh, I don't have time for this exercise because I have to do some administrative stuff or I have to do this, try to bring it back home to the tactical warfighting implication. Because at the end of the day, that's kind of the core thing that you have to orient yourself on, right? What does this mean for my ability to win a war against China in the next few years? And yeah, I just think we need better perspective. In terms of what you mentioned about self-deception, that's definitely a piece of this. Another problem is that when it comes to the state of decay and the atrophy, it's existed for so long that there are people who genuinely don't know what right looks like. This was a theme of the 2017 reports that came out after those fatal collisions. Normalization of deviation was the term that was used. And they applied that theme of deviation across so many other functions of the Navy when it came to ship handling and maintenance and all other kinds of things. That theme also applies to the warfighting development of the Navy and knowing how to fight. And so, we should be clear-eyed about the challenge here, and we should be prepared. We should be prepared to face some pretty uncomfortable truths as we get ready for the next high-end war at sea.
Also, was hat uns das alles hier gezeigt? Naja, als erstes, das mit dem Petrodollar habe ich nicht gezeigt, weil ich sage, oh, wie böse der Petrodollar ist. Der ist mir scheißegal, der ist halt einfach so und hat auch relativ gut funktioniert. Darum geht es jetzt nicht. Es geht einfach darum, dass dieses System gerade unter Druck gesetzt wird, was alleine für sich genommen das wahrscheinlich sogar aushalten könnte. Also würde irgendwas Neues finden und ja gut, ne, ist halt so. Aber besonders die europäischen Staaten werden damit sehr, sehr, sehr stark unter Druck gesetzt. Stärker noch als die USA. Gleichzeitig haben wir aber diese gigantischen Staatsausgaben, einmal für die Rente, für irgendwelche Migranten hier, die, doch nicht so produktiv sind, wie man früher gedacht hat, um es mal ganz, 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 ganz sanft auszudrücken. Und dann halt noch dieser gigantische bürokratische Apparat, der halt auch unfassbare Ressourcen frisst. Dann noch hinzukommend diese wunderbare Energiewende, die man da gemacht hat. Ja, das ist quasi die erste große Krise. Die zweite große Krise ist, was dann im zweiten Teil kam, dass die militärische Situation doch nicht so eindeutig ist, wie man es immer leicht glauben möchte. Und das dritte große Ding war die fehlende Kohäsion. Dass alles an diesem System heutzutage irgendwie einfach müde erscheint. Egal, ob es einfach daran liegt, dass die, sagen wir, staatstragende Elite halt langsam einfach an die 70 geht oder halt einfach wirklich alles so, ja, wie ausgebrannt sich anfühlt. Und eben nicht diese interne Kohäsion besteht. Quasi, wo besonders auch die Jugend, besonders auch, also durch eigentlich alle Bevölkerungsschichten, alle Deutschen zusammenstehen können und sagen, dieser Staat arbeitet für uns. Und das tut er nicht. Der arbeitet für die gesamte Welt. Für jeden, den er möchte. Außer für Deutsche. Und ob das jetzt so stimmt oder nicht, das ist mal daneben hergestellt, weil das ist das Gefühl, was gerade Sache ist. Und das löst man nicht einfach mal so eben. Das ist ja gerade das Wichtige, was ich damit mit all diesen Szenen da zeigen wollte. Das ist nicht mal eben mit so ein bisschen PR-Kampagne und dann machen wir mal Tag der Bundeswehr und dann läuft das alles wieder. Nein, das ist ein tiefgreifendes Problem. Das ist alles, also während Corona, während den letzten 10, 20 Jahren, die tagtägliche Erfahrung, all diese Sachen spielen hier eine Rolle und die kann man nicht wirklich einfach nur mit PR wegmanagen. Das sind fundamentale, konkrete Probleme. Die können nicht einfach nur wegverwaltet werden. Und das ist halt, also diese drei wirklich wichtigen Punkte, die gleichzeitig auf uns halt gerade hereinbrechen. Ich sehe einfach nicht, dass die gelöst werden. Ich sehe es nicht. Also nicht mit der jetzigen Elite. Oder vielleicht haben die irgendwie, also entweder haben sie bereits aufgegeben und sagen so, ja, dann ist halt so. Oder die sehen einfach, also ich weiß es nicht. Das ist ja gerade das nächste Problem unserer heutigen Zeit. Du weißt ja nicht mehr, was wirklich echt ist. Was nur PR ist und was halt wirklich, also gibt's ja nicht. Es gibt ja keine Wahrheit mehr. Das ist ja das Blöde, das nächste. Und das führt uns quasi zu der Frage, was machen wir? Und das ist wirklich keine leichte Frage. Also ich werde definitiv nicht gegen Deutschland arbeiten, weil man ist ja immer noch Deutscher. Also egal, ob sich der deutsche Staat jetzt BRD, Deutscher Bund oder Kaiserreich nennt, das ist egal, das ist immer noch Deutschland. Aber auf der anderen Seite, für diese Bundesrepublik in Deutschland, ja was gibt die ein? So 10 Milliarden Ausländer. So, und Steuern. Toll. Top. Ich glaube, das Einzige, was wir tun können, ist unseren kleinen Bereich, unser Mikrokosmos. Für uns, für unsere Familie, für die uns wichtig nahe sind. Zumindest dafür sorgen, dass wir vielleicht den kommenden Sturm überleben. Und wenn hier zu diesem Video ein paar Leute zuhören, die aus höheren Schichten kommen, ihr wisst, wer ihr seid. Vielleicht könnt ihr mehr tun. Aber der Großteil wird einfach nur versuchen können, dass man ein Beet anlegt, aus dem nachher wieder etwas Größeres wachsen kann. Und das ist, glaube ich, die schwierige Wahrheit unserer Zeit. Dass wir nicht verhindern werden können, was kommen wird. Aber wir können Sachen bewahren, die Zukunft besser machen werden. Egal, ob es 50 oder 500 Jahre dauern wird, es wird wieder besser. Das ist meine Hoffnung.
Nicht der Pflicht, nur zu genügen, was sie fordert und verlangt. Nicht der Stunde nur zu leben, was sie gilt und was sie langt. Freunde einen Schultern rollen, gelte unseres Tages Lauf. Über Sturm und über Wolken, Sonnen gegen trag's uns auf. Über Sturm und über Wolken, Sonnen gegen trag's
Gehen Sie hinaus, tragen Sie die Kunde weiter und glauben Sie an dieses Land.